In the early 1930s, as the Great Depression deepened across America, silence settled over the fields and factories that had once pulsed with work. Dust covered the plains, wages disappeared, and families who had known modest comfort found themselves counting every nail, every seed, every scrap of fabric. In this landscape of scarcity, women in rural towns began to create beauty out of what little remained. On wooden porches and kitchen tables, they unfolded empty cotton flour sacks, washed away the smell of grain, and scrubbed off the printed logos of mills and feed companies. The coarse cloth, once meant only to hold wheat or cornmeal, became the raw material of survival. Hands that had once sewn for leisure now stitched out of necessity, turning the remnants of the nation's hunger into garments for husbands, children, and neighbors. The fabric was heavy and imperfect, but it carried warmth and pride. Over time, the faded brand names and faint lettering of milling companies blended into patterns, becoming accidental decorations on dresses, aprons, and shirts. What began as quiet improvisation spread across counties and states until it became a silent movement. Each seam reflected endurance, each hemline a refusal to surrender to despair. In an age when luxury had vanished and money lost its worth, these women transformed utility into grace. From the dust of the Depression, a new kind of fashion emerged, one that carried no glamour but immense dignity. Later historians would call it feed sack fashion, but at the time it was simply the art of survival sewn into every stitch. During the Great Depression, fabric became a luxury that few could afford. As cotton prices rose and textile mills closed, entire communities across rural America slipped into an economy of barter and self-reliance. Families survived on what they could grow, trade, or repair. Store-bought clothing vanished from daily life, and the few garments people owned were mended until the seams could no longer hold. Mothers patched over patches, sewing by lamplight to stretch the life of every shirt and dress. Yet even the most frugal households eventually ran out of fabric. The collapse of the textile industry meant that new cloth was either unavailable or priced beyond reach, and many small-town stores stopped stocking it altogether. In this vacuum of material, necessity turned into invention. Empty cotton sacks, once used to hold flour, sugar, or animal feed, began to replace the bolts of fabric that had disappeared from shelves. Their tightly woven texture made them surprisingly durable, and their soft feel after washing made them suitable for clothing. Reports from the Farm Security Administration described how farm women collected, washed, and bleached these sacks to remove company logos and lettering before cutting them into patterns. What had begun as packaging was reborn as a source of warmth and pride. A flour sack could become a pillowcase, a curtain, a child's shirt, or a woman's Sunday dress. Each transformation carried with it the same quiet defiance that marked so much of rural life in the 1930s. In towns where cash had lost its meaning, these scraps of cotton became a new kind of currency, traded, shared, and cherished. They did not only cover bodies, they preserved dignity in a time when even that was hard to afford. Cotton sacks had entered American homes long before the Depression, but their role changed profoundly in the 1920s and 1930s. Before that time, flour and feed were packed in rough jute or burlap bags that were scratchy and almost impossible to reuse for clothing. As cotton became more affordable in the 1920s, manufacturers began replacing coarse materials with tightly woven cotton fabric, which kept the product dry and clean while also being lighter to transport. What started as an industrial improvement soon turned into an unintended blessing for households living on the edge of poverty. By the early 1930s, as the economic collapse spread through the country, these cotton sacks became one of the few reliable sources of fabric available to rural families. Women saved every empty sack that came into their homes, aware that the fabric might be needed for a shirt or a curtain before the month was over. By the late 1930s, the growing reuse of sacks caught the attention of flour and feed companies. Representatives from firms such as Bemis Bro, Bag Company, Staley Milling, and Southern Mill Bag Company realized that their packaging had become a domestic material as valuable as the product it carried. In response, they began to print decorative patterns on their sacks, floral motifs, checks, stripes, and tiny geometric shapes that would look pleasant when turned into clothing. This innovation, first tested around 1937, spread rapidly across the industry. By 1939, pattern feed sacks had become a national standard. Some manufacturers even added small instructions on the edges of the cloth, explaining how to wash out the ink or remove the printed company name with soap and hot water. What began as a marketing decision turned into a social phenomenon. For the first time, industry acknowledged the creativity of its pursed consumers. These printed sacks were not simply containers anymore. They became an unspoken partnership between factory and farmhouse, where commerce and necessity met on a single piece of cotton. The appearance of printed feed sacks in the late 1930s coincided with a growing sense of community among rural women who were learning to adapt to scarcity through cooperation. As the new patterned sacks began to circulate, magazines such as the Farmer's Wife magazine, Home Arts Needlecraft, and Progressive Farmer started publishing illustrated guides that explained how to wash, cut, and sew the fabric into clothing. These articles were not advertisements but practical lessons written for women who could no longer afford store-bought fabric. The advice ranged from how to match patterns between multiple sacks to how to use every inch of cloth, even the seams, for children's garments. County extension offices and home demonstration clubs, supported by the USDA, held local meetings where women shared designs and exchanged fabric. It was during these gatherings that the reuse of feed sacks transformed from an act of necessity into a social movement built on creativity and solidarity. By 1939, several flour and feed companies recognized this cultural shift and began sponsoring contests that rewarded women for their ingenuity. The Textile Bag Manufacturers Association promoted the first national sewing competitions, inviting participants to submit dresses, aprons, and quilts made entirely from printed sacks. Photographs of the winning garments were published in newspapers across the Midwest and South, showing that poverty had not extinguished elegance. The contests quickly grew in popularity, and the same companies that had once shipped grain began to compete for who could produce the prettiest prints. Housewives wrote letters requesting specific floral patterns or matching colors so they could complete a full outfit. Across the country, women began trading feed sacks as if they were bolts of fine cloth, matching prints by mill and brand. What had started as an act of survival had become a shared language of invention and pride, a way for women to reassert control over their world in a time when everything else seemed beyond repair. Sewing with feed sacks gradually became a defining element of domestic life in rural America. By the late 1930s, women had turned the reuse of these cotton bags into a regular household practice that blended economy, artistry, and pride. In small towns and farming communities, sewing circles formed in kitchens, schoolhouses, and church basements where women gathered after chores to share patterns and advice. They discussed how to bleach ink, how to align the floral prints across seams, and how to piece together sacks from different brands to make one matching dress. Some exchanged feed sacks through community networks, or mailed them to relatives in other states to complete a set. What had begun as quiet individual labor grew into a collective tradition that sustained both clothing and companionship. By the early 1940s, the feed sack industry recognized how deeply this practice had taken root. Manufacturers began printing detailed sewing instructions on the borders of the sacks, including suggestions for garment types and washing directions. Some even introduced printed outlines for children's clothing or household linens that could be cut and stitched directly from the fabric. Feed and flour companies competed to produce the most appealing prints, knowing that the beauty of their sacks could determine a customer's loyalty as much as the quality of the flour itself. Women started to judge a sack of meal not only by its contents, but by the charm of its pattern. A purchase became both a practical necessity and a small act of aesthetic choice. Inside homes, every scrap of cloth was put to use. Larger pieces became dresses or shirts, while the remnants were turned into aprons, pillowcases, and quilts. Many women taught their daughters to sew on these fabrics, passing down both technique and resilience. What had once been the residue of hunger became a lesson in perseverance. Through repetition and care, these women elevated simple utility into quiet craftsmanship. In each stitch they affirmed that scarcity could be met with skill, and that even the most ordinary material could sustain both a family and a sense of grace. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, the same spirit of thrift that had defined the Depression returned under a new banner. The War Production Board imposed strict rationing on textiles, redirecting cotton, wool, and silk toward uniforms, tents, and bandages for the military. Civilian clothing production fell sharply, and the little fabric that remained on the market was limited by coupon books and quotas. Once again, American households looked inward for solutions. The women who had once relied on feed sacks during the Depression already knew how to manage scarcity, and their resourcefulness became part of the home front's moral economy. Across the country, sewing rooms and basements filled with the familiar rhythm of scissors and needles as families turned feed sacks back into garments. Manufacturers quickly adapted to the new patriotic mood. Flour and feed companies released sacks printed with stars, stripes, and red, white, and blue motifs that echoed the symbols of national unity. Some mills printed messages encouraging thrift and conservation, blending advertising with wartime propaganda. The idea that every material could serve the nation was reinforced through posters and radio broadcasts produced by the War Production Board, which urged Americans to use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. The slogan captured the ethic of the era, transforming domestic frugality into an act of patriotism. Wearing a dress made from a feed sack was no longer seen as a sign of poverty but as evidence of loyalty and practical strength. The recycling of feed sacks also aligned with broader wartime campaigns that collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for defense production. Every act of reuse was presented as a contribution to victory. Home economists and extension agents praised women who transformed ordinary packaging into serviceable clothing, calling them examples of citizenship through economy. By 1943, feed sack garments appeared in exhibitions organized by local war committees to demonstrate how resourcefulness could support national goals. What had begun as a strategy of survival now became an expression of unity and shared sacrifice. Through needle and thread, American women joined a different kind of battlefront, one fought with fabric, patience, and resolve. In the years that followed the Second World War, feed sack fashion evolved from a symbol of necessity into an object of national reflection. As prosperity gradually returned, store-bought fabrics once again filled the shelves, yet the memory of handmade clothing stitched from flour sacks remained vivid in the minds of those who had lived through the Depression and the war. Newspapers across the Midwest and South began publishing nostalgic articles that celebrated the ingenuity of rural women who had turned ordinary packaging into something beautiful. Editors framed these stories as lessons in resilience, showing how art could emerge from hardship. What had once been dismissed as poverty's improvisation was now praised as an early form of design thinking rooted in sustainability and self-sufficiency. Museums and historical societies soon recognized the cultural importance of these garments. Curators in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma began collecting feed sack dresses, aprons, and quilts as artifacts of domestic history. In the 1950s, several regional exhibitions presented these items alongside photographs from Farm Security Administration archives, creating visual connections between economic struggle and creative endurance. The garments were no longer simply household relics but documents of social transformation. By the 1970s, scholars of American material culture had begun to analyze feed sack fashion as one of the earliest large-scale examples of textile recycling. The idea of repurposing materials for new uses, today called upcycling, had its quiet origins in these cotton sacks. In universities and community centers, lectures and textile displays traced the journey of the feed sack from warehouse to wardrobe, highlighting how necessity had inspired a democratic form of design. These exhibitions presented not luxury but honesty, revealing a period when the boundary between survival and creativity disappeared. For many historians of fashion, the feed sack dress became as iconic as any couture gown because it embodied a distinctly American form of elegance born from restraint. A fabric that once carried grain had entered the history of design, standing as proof that invention often grows from the simplest materials. Today, the surviving dresses, aprons, and children's garments sewn from flour and feed sacks rest in museum collections across the United States, their colors softened by time yet still carrying the quiet dignity of their origins. In the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of American History, and the Kansas Historical Society, these artifacts are preserved not as curiosities but as evidence of how creativity and endurance shaped daily life during the nation's hardest years. Their faded floral prints and careful stitches speak to a generation that refused to let poverty erase grace. Each seam documents a story of work, resilience, and care, offering a tactile memory of how people rebuilt their world through skill rather than wealth. Museum curators have come to regard feed sack garments as essential pieces of social history. They are displayed alongside the photographs of Farm Security Administration artists and Depression-era home demonstration materials, creating a visual dialogue between labor and beauty. Visitors are often struck by the elegance of the designs, which reveal how resourcefulness could coexist with artistry. These garments show that fashion did not belong only to cities or runways but could emerge from fields, kitchens, and community halls. In exhibitions and educational programs, historians use feed sack clothing to explore questions of gender, class, and sustainability. The garments illustrate how women transformed domestic work into cultural expression and how their creativity anticipated the modern idea of environmental responsibility. What began as an act of survival has become a symbol of endurance and self-determination. The feed sack dress endures as a reminder that beauty is not the privilege of abundance but the companion of perseverance, that the hands which once stitched out of necessity also stitched identity. The quiet threads of these garments still connect past and present, teaching that dignity can be crafted from the simplest cloth. The story of feed sack clothing was ultimately a story about endurance and imagination. When the foundations of the economy collapsed, women across America created a new form of wealth that could not be measured in dollars or possessions. Through their hands, the remnants of industry were transformed into symbols of care and identity. Their sewing tables became quiet workshops of resilience, where beauty was not purchased but built, thread by thread. In the act of turning a sack meant for grain into a garment meant for living, they affirmed the worth of labor and the dignity of those who refused to surrender to despair. These garments carried more than fabric. They carried the philosophy of survival shaped by the Great Depression. Each one embodied the belief that creativity could restore what poverty had taken away. By sewing, women reconnected communities, passing skills and values across generations. Their work stitched together not only seams but the torn social fabric of a nation learning to rebuild itself. In an era defined by scarcity, the feed sack dress became proof that hope could take a physical form. It showed that the measure of civilization was not in its abundance but in its ability to transform hardship into meaning. Decades later, the quiet artistry of these women continued to speak. Their dresses stood as evidence that invention often arises from limits, and that necessity can be the mother of grace as well as invention. The feed sack fashion did not celebrate poverty. It celebrated the will to live beautifully in spite of it. Within its simple folds survived a moral truth of the Great Depression, that when the world offered nothing, human hands could still make something lasting.